What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little different. Today talking about how sponsorships work on YouTube, in my experience at the very least. So if this is the first video of mine you're watching, normally I cover video games. Like with most YouTube channels that get to a decent size, I started accepting sponsorships, and it occurs to me that some people might find that process interesting. That said, right at the beginning here, feel free to just listen. I doubt there's going to be too much in the way of super required viewing here. So if you want to just listen, feel free to do so. Second of all, as I mentioned, this is in my experience. Every channel is probably going to have a slightly different experience. For instance, in my case in particular, I refuse sponsorships for those like 30-second to 1-minute ads at the beginning of a video. I just frankly don't like them, so I don't do them. Starting with that, I figured we could jump in right there, and that is basically the types of sponsorships. Now, at least for what I do, it comes in basically two forms. Either those shorter integrations, which are the ads at the beginning of a video, or a dedicated video where the entire video is a sponsorship. Now, in both cases, you are required to disclose these things, the method of which does vary a little bit by where you are, but where I am, it's basically just clearly labeling it as sponsored and also mentioning that it's sponsored in the video. So right off the bat, the shorter integrations at the beginning of a video, I don't really like to do personally because I used to work in sales, etc. before I was doing this full time, and those shorter ads are basically a product showcase where you're trying to sell somebody a product that doesn't specifically relate to video games. Oftentimes it'll be, in my case, peripherals or things an audience of mostly 18 to 45-year-old men would be interested in, which is why you'll see gaming channels do things like the Manscaped ads, etc. Because while I can't speak for everyone, YouTube demographics tell me that my audience is about 96% men. But as I mentioned, I just don't like doing those because I used to work in sales and retail and management and doing all those things, and I just don't find that work fulfilling. So despite them being willing to pay me specifically to do it, I just don't like to because I don't like hawking products these days. Or at least products like that, because obviously video games are themselves products as well. The main difference just being that I actually enjoy video games. The second part of that is just that I don't like watching those ads at the beginning of a video, and I always skip past them. So it occurs to me that at least some people are probably doing the same thing. Now, that's no offense to the creators who actually choose to do them. Everybody's got to make their money. I'm just explaining my personal preference in that regard. But from here, let's talk about how we actually get to that point where we're putting this stuff in the video, because that's where it varies a little bit. Now, again, in my experience, this pretty much always starts with someone contacting your business email, which is usually attached to the About section of your YouTube channel. Now, right off the bat, just with the contact, it is smart to immediately try to verify any source like this. And just as a few generalities about how this tends to work, in my case, because it's for video games, I will usually be contacted by a PR company working on behalf of the developer or a PR company that works as a department, etc. within a publisher. These people are usually running an ad campaign of some sort, and they'll reach out to offer you the sponsorship. Now, these emails will usually include what the sponsorship is, the immediate details, such as this video game, this time frame, and they'll usually ask for your rate right at the beginning. Now, that's important to note because a lot of your scam type emails trying to get you to agree to something, etc., are more often than not lacking in any real detail. These fake sponsorship offers, if you will just be like, "We have an offer and we were impressed by your channel. Please contact us." So first thing you want to do again is verify. So try to make sure the people contacting you are actually the people contacting you. Usually by verifying emails, the company they work for, that type of stuff. As I already mentioned, I don't like the shorter ads. So for me, if it is one of those, I immediately turn it down. Or if it's a game I don't find interesting, I'll immediately turn it down. Looking at you, Raid Shadow Legends. So that leaves us with pretty much dedicated videos for whole games. This will begin an email process back and forth about things like pricing, as well as signing a formal contract, which is usually part of these sponsorship deals. as obviously you don't want to take somebody's word that they're going to pay you. Along with all of this stuff usually comes a set of talking points, stuff they specifically want mentioned. And then from here, what tends to vary is the quality of the sponsor, in my opinion. So a few things that I've run into are whether or not a sponsor wants to look at your video before it's published, which isn't that unusual, but it's also not super common. A lot of times sponsors are basically happy with the way you run your business, that they would rather just leave that up to you, and if they have a problem, they'll come find you after the fact. But basically, as long as the sponsorship showcases their talking points, they're usually good to go. Some sponsors, however, will want to see the video beforehand, and this is where it can get dicey. So if they want the content changed, that's usually a no-go for me. And whether or not they want to see it beforehand is usually part of the contract as well. Now, a good sponsor, if they are doing this, is basically just looking at whether or not it's using language or just making them look bad, basically, as obviously they're trying to sell something as well. In my case, a video game, which isn't a huge deal, but it's one of those things that can kind of go either way. Now, in addition to this, contracts will usually dictate the minimum length of a video, and of course the time frame with which it is supposed to be published. All of that is relatively straightforward, but there's a few other things I wanted to talk about as well. Now, in terms of getting paid, this usually takes around a couple of weeks after the video goes live, as I have to invoice the company that sponsored the video. They, of course, have to run that invoice through their accounting department, basically, who then eventually pays you out. Now, most contracts will allow for 30 days after the completion of your end to the time you get paid, which is quite standard. And if there's a problem there, remember, this is why you have a contract. Contracts work both ways. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about really is that it's important to protect your reputation when it comes to sponsorships. Now, in my case in particular, I review a lot of video games, which means when I take on sponsorships to show off video games to my audience, I have to make sure that I am protecting my integrity, at least to the capacity that I am satisfied with it. Now, for me in particular, I never do sponsored reviews. I think doing anything like that kind of throws any amount of credibility you would have on that subject out the window. So for these dedicated game videos that I make for sponsorships, I prefer to keep them more, this is what this game is, here's the highlights, and just kind of bring it to their attention. In my case, I try to make these videos as much as they can be just like my normal content, which is also usually me going, hey, here's this game, here's the highlights, and we move on. So in that way, I think I can integrate them pretty well into my content without it being a huge deal. But I do think there absolutely comes a point where you're accepting sponsorships that just aren't good. Like, for instance, I wouldn't consider anybody sponsoring Raid Shadow Legends a good thing. It's my understanding they pay very well, so again, I can see why people do it. But it's also a terrible mobile game designed to siphon as much money out of people as possible. And the sponsorships for that game in particular tend to come with what are called icebreakers, which is essentially a really good initial deal on their monetization method that then breaks the ice of you spending more money on it, as you've already spent money on it, which fuels engagement basically, so you'll feel less bad about it. And it's a psychological trick to get you to spend more money on this mobile game, which is one of many reasons people don't like mobile games. So when people start hawking stuff like that via sponsorships, while the reception may or may not be good depending on their audience, it does admittedly affect how things are seen. Now, I pick Raid Shadow Legends here because that one's a pretty widely disliked one, but I think you get my point. So in my particular case, what I'm happy with is dedicated videos about games I would already be interested in, and it basically has to fit into the context of my normal content, and it's certainly never going to be for a review. Other channels do this differently, but that is how it works for me. But that's going to pretty much do it, guys. An overview of sponsorships, at least how they have worked for me. So there you guys go. Hope you enjoyed the video, found it informative, all that stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.